Okay, now we get to the interesting part. Starting to weld this together to the point where I need to relate the rotational position of components relative to one another about this pipe. So far, the only thing that's welded to it was these lugs, and they could be anywhere because everything's going to relate back to them. So now I'm going to weld on the blade rests. These are going to hook on to the blade of the excavator and bear the weight of the forks when I'm using it in that configuration. They have to be in a particular place on the tube. And so the build orientation I've selected for this is the forks level, which they're not on yet, but that's the idea. When the forks are level, the inboard pin is 2 inches lower than the outboard pin. So I cut a little block of wood, it's 2 inches square, and set a level on my gauge block to the other pin, and shimmed this block of wood until that was level. So I'm going to do the same thing when I weld the forks on, and I'm going to set them to level. So this is the build orientation. And then I came out here, and this isn't perfectly straight, but I checked both sides for level, and I shimmed the low end until it was level this way. Of course, I had to recheck because that affected this as well. But I got both of those level. And then I know that the hook in the height direction is coincident with the center line of the tube. And the tube is 6 5/8. And so this hook needs to be 3 5/16 down from the top of the tube. So I made a little gauge where from the tangent point of this plug to the flat here is 3 5/16. And I set it in the hook, and set the level across, and adjusted the position of this hook until that was level. And that's held on with magnets. So this is a line. This is where I want it relative to these, so I'm ready to weld this. And if you're wondering about the two gloves thing, I like the thin work gloves for the dexterity for running the torch, but quite often you pin the knuckles of your left hand to the workpiece and then use it as a rest or a guide for the welding torch. And that's hot, and there's a lot of weld splatter that gets around the end of the shorty gloves and things. So I find that a big, heavy, thick welding gauntlet on the left and a thin work glove on the right works pretty well. Just looks funny. All right. This is probably the most interesting alignment-wise of the project. I'm calling these the lever tubes. These are what will support the load back to the blade rest when this is used in that configuration. But to make sure there's room to get this pin out, they're at an angle, sweeping back. The forks will be that way. And so I modeled this and I got it all the way I wanted it, and then I went in and just measured some dimensions so I could align this. So I know that there's 17 and a half, or the 19 and a half pitch, 17 and a half inside to inside. And so I could lay it out from the center line of the lugs here and scribe 2 lines where the sides of this tube go. And I knew that the top edge of this tube was 0.596 down from the apex of the tube. So I got a level and calipers and I scribed a horizontal line there. So I'm able to get that where it needs to be. And then I picked a point out here 2 feet back and measured, and that needs to be 3.936 down from the top of this tube. So I cut this piece of wood to that dimension, marked, rested it there, and set a level across. And of course that was too low, so then had to space everything else up a little bit to get it to fit. But I've got the same initial alignment I had before, where these are 2 inches different, and it's level across, and I've got wooden wedges and spacers set to hold this in orientation. And then I have 2 wooden wedges here so that I can set this on my scribes there and then raise this tail end here and rotate it to get this level that way and pitched correctly this way using my spacer block. And then to get the last degree of freedom, it's pretty awkward because use a framing square on the tube here, but these lugs are in the way. So I had to kind of set that like this and take another ruler and measure under to the sidewall here and there. Futz around with it until those came out equal. But all of that's done. And so this lever tube is pitched correctly, is square to the tube wall, is rolled correctly. So it's ready to weld. Luckily, the next lever tube is actually a lot easier to set up because I don't have to do any of the angles. I can just make it coplanar to this one and parallel. I can tape measure across and place the level across and not reproduce all that work. So it should go pretty quick. All right, last piece is these forks. By far the hardest part of this setup has been finding space to walk in the shop. This is not a big enough space to be doing this in. Can't even get the camera far enough away to get a good view of what I'm doing here, so you'll have to use your imagination a little bit. Set up the rest of the weldment in build orientation. The lugs are 2 inches different. Tube is level. Brought in 2 pieces of aluminum extrusion to extend my workbench wide enough to support the forks. 4 wooden wedges let me adjust the height of those. I set the top surface of the forks coincident with the center line of the tubes. So that's measured down from a level 3 5/16. Then just use a long level, width and length, near and far, both forks, to get them horizontal. Flush them with the outside of the tube caps with magnets. Set the distance at the end with tape measure. Measure the diagonals to square it. All the while sucking in my gut and squeezing past things as necessary to get where I need to be. Now everything is aligned. It's time once again to get welding. I'm out of wire. I have like 3 inches of weld left. Well, that's not fair. I still have second pass to do top and bottom. Man, I was almost done. Well, brief intermission for a supply run, I guess. See you in a couple of days.